Good morning, everyone, and happy Women's Day. Welcome to this webinar on women on the bench, the role of women judges in fragile states. This is a webinar that is co-hosted by the Bergen Global and the Center on Law and Social Transformation. And my name is Siri Gloppen, and I am the director of the Center on Law and Social Transformation. I'm also a member of the project team for the project that we're going to hear from today. And the project on Women on the Bench is based at the Christian Michelsen Institute in Bergen, where it is led by Elin Skov. And we will have three of the researchers from the Women on the Bench team give us insights from three different countries today. Torunn Wimpelmann, who's a senior researcher at the Christian Michelsen Institute, has a long-standing expertise from Afghanistan and is working at the intersection of anthropology and political science. Marianne Tøraasen is a PhD candidate at the Christian Michelsen Institute and the Department of Comparative Politics at the University of Bergen, and has done a lot of field work on women, the role of women judges and the situation of women judges in Haiti. And last but certainly not least, Pilar Domingo from the Overseas Development Institute, the ODI in London, has broad experience on a lot of issues related to gender and the role of women in leadership positions. And she has done field work on the role of women judges in Uganda. So together we will have an hour. We will talk about different perspectives on being a woman judge in a very challenging context. And I want to start by asking each of you to briefly describe the presence of women in courts in the countries that you've been studying and in decision-making positions in society, in these societies more generally. So, Torunn, how is this in Afghanistan? You need to unmute.
I thought I did. Thank you, Siri. So in Afghanistan, women make up about 11% of the judiciary. And this has increased quite a lot from pretty much zero when the Taliban was driven from power. Only in 2007 it was 3%, and now it's around 11%, or around 260 female judges. Most of the female judges are located in the capital, Kabul, with a few dozen posted elsewhere, primarily in the two other largest cities in Afghanistan, Herat and Mazar-e-Sharif. And a handful is working in other provinces in the country, generally those who are relatively safe and liberal. The highest position in the Afghan courts is held by a woman, which is held by a woman, is in the specialized court for serious crimes, which is headed by Anisa Rasooli, who was also nominated for the Supreme Court, but she was not approved in Parliament. And there is another 15 female judges in the Supreme Court, and there's a handful in the other specialized courts. But most of the female judges in Afghanistan are in family courts and primary courts, and very few of them head those courts, which is a position of some authority. Those who are head of courts can generally allocate cases and approve decisions. So in generally, I would say there is not that many female judges in total, although given the history of Afghanistan, that's perhaps not very surprising. And those female judges that are there are generally at the lower echelons of the judiciary.
So I just want to clarify, because you said that there were 15 other judges in the Supreme Court, but I guess that is in the high courts.
Yeah, sorry, yeah, in the high court, so scrutinizing decisions and so on, but not in the council
so this is very interesting. So there has been quite a rapid increase from, you said, from zero in a relatively short time.
Yes,
so,
it has.
Yeah, very, very interesting. So how is this in Haiti, Marianne?
Well, in Haiti, women are almost absent from decision-making roles, and it's very similar to Afghanistan. There are around 12% women judges in Haiti. And compared to the rest of Latin America, that number is very low, because the Latin American average is around 31% women judges. So Haiti is lagging behind its neighbors in that regard. But the women judges are found on all levels of courts. You have women judges in the lowest courts, the peace tribunals, and at the level of courts of first instance, the appeals court. And there's also one woman judge in the Supreme Court, who I think is the only woman who's ever sat on the Supreme. No, it's the second woman who sat on the Supreme Court. But the last thing I heard from that situation is that she was forced into retirement by the president, one of 3 judges who was opposing the president, so he prematurely sent them into retirement. So I guess that makes it 0 women in the Supreme Court at the moment, but she's working on it, so hopefully she will be able to return. So you can say that 12% is quite a modest number, but there has been, as in Afghanistan, quite an important increase since the mid-1990s, when there were around 2% women judges, so an increase of 10% the last decades. And also, when you compare women's presence in the judicial sphere to women's presence in the political sphere, they are doing far better in the judiciary, because there's just 3% women in today's parliament in Haiti, which is among the lowest numbers in the world when it comes to women's political representation. Yeah, so these numbers suggest that there has happened something in the judicial sphere that's not yet mirrored in the political sphere. And as in Afghanistan, you find most women judges in the capital and in the bigger cities.
Thank you, Marianne. That's really very interesting, and of course a little bit of a puzzle why you see more women in the judiciary than in parliament, coming from the same levels. I just wanted to go quickly back to you, Torunn, to hear what is it like for women with regard to political representation in Afghanistan?
Well, in parliament, the number is much higher, but there's a quota system. So there's about 25% quota system, and the ratio of female parliamentarians is pretty much exactly that. And executive level, I think at the moment there is 3 female ministers out of 14. So yeah, in general, I would say that the judiciary is, I mean, civil service, women in civil service is higher than judges in total. But yeah, in women in politics there are fairly few women in politics.
Interesting. So here we see quite some differences. So that's we also are already seeing some of the reasons why. So that's very interesting. So Pilar, the Uganda is quite a different situation, isn't it?
Yes. Sorry. So in Uganda, it's a much more positive context in comparison to the figures that we've been hearing. So more or less, there's a 45% of judges are women, with a higher percentage at the lower level of 47%, but still in the higher courts, we're talking about 39% of the positions are filled by women. And this is in spite of, there's no formal affirmative action for the judiciary, although the 1995 Constitution does commit to making all institutions representative. And in fact, there are more women judges than there are women in Parliament, where they make up around 34% of parliamentarians, and that's also with after 25 years of electoral quotas. And in the cabinet, they make up about 30% of cabinet ministers, although it would be interesting to ask the extent to which cabinet positions are the hard positions and not only the more softer cabinet roles. But mostly women have not accessed the main leadership positions in judicial power. So the Chief Justice, the Principal Justice, the Chief Registrar, heads of the High Court divisions, almost without exception, are men. Women do occupy deputy roles, but they tend to be passed over for the high positions.
Thank you, Pilar. So now we really see that there is quite a scale here, and of course there is also a difference. I mean, we're talking about women judges in fragile states, but of course the level of fragility and stability in these countries are also very different. So we are talking about very different countries, but still it's really interesting to try to reflect around why we see this pattern and what it means. Before we go more into that, I just want to invite everyone who's listening to come with questions. This will be a debate, so you're welcome to ask questions in the chat or in the Q&A at any point, and we'll ask the panelists as we go along. My first question, following this description, that very, very interesting picture that you're drawing up, is about sort of, I'm just wondering, are the paths to the bench very different in these countries? Why are we seeing these differences? What's helping and hindering women judges on their or women who want to be judges in these countries? So I wanted to ask, maybe I'll start with Haiti, where clearly it started from a very low level and has been some improvement. So Marianne, how are the women's judges' pathways to the bench in Haiti?
Well, what's interesting about Haiti is that there are two pathways to the bench existing at the same time. You have one through direct appointments, and the other is through appointments through the Magistrate School, or the School for Judicial Position. Magistrates are judges and prosecutors in Haiti. And what I've learned from the Haitian case is that it is much, much harder for women to get directly appointment to the bench than it is to go through the Magistrate School. And the creation of the Magistrate School in 1995 as a result of judicial reform and state-building efforts can largely explain why we have seen this increase from 2 to 12%. And the reason for that is that direct appointments relies heavily on political contacts, like who you know close to power, that has the power to support you and your candidature to the judiciary. Whereas the Magistrate School is more transparent, and you can say like merit-based way of appointing judges, and it's based on academic qualifications and examination results, where women tend to do really good. So even though the procedure for direct appointments is clearly stated in the law, like this is how you're supposed to do, you need so many years of experience, and you're supposed to be nominated by a committee, etc. This is not really followed in practice, as many things in Haiti, because the process is really much more arbitrary, and it remains really, really politicized. So if you know a deputy, if you know a senator, your chances are much better that you will get appointed as judge. And this, of course, requires access to powerful networks, which are mostly dominated by men in Haiti and also elsewhere. And since women has been largely absent from these spheres, it's really they are still seen as outsiders in these spheres of power, and are highly disadvantaged when it comes to accessing these networks. So according to my interviewees, the gatekeepers are usually men, and they tend to favor other men as well, even when qualifications and professional experiences between male and female candidates are equal. So the overall dynamic of these direct appointments is very informal and also highly gendered. But then you have the Magistrate School that was created in 1995, and the idea behind this school was to create a new breed of judges and prosecutors in order to distance Haiti from its authoritative past with conflicts and dictators, etc., to make the judiciary much more professional and also independent. So to enroll at this school, you need to pass an exam, and judges are appointed automatically after graduation. So you don't need to have access to these powerful, influential networks in order to get appointment as judge. You just have to have good enough grades. So this is a very interesting, because you see it's almost like a natural experiment where you have these two paths to the judiciary, and you see that women are clearly overrepresented, like in when it comes to graduates from the school, and men dominate the direct appointment procedure.
Thank you, Marianne. I have a question in the chat, so I'll ask you now, because it goes to all of you, and you can include it when I go to the rest of you. And it's a question about, could you say something about the personal costs and risks of women serving in high positions and low in the judiciary?
Yeah, should I address?
Yes, you can do that, and then the rest can include it.
Well, I don't know about the other cases, but being a judge in Haiti can be quite. It's definitely very challenging, but it can also be quite dangerous. Especially the past years, there's been several attacks on justice actors and also judges. So when I talked to the judges in Haiti, there was this constant feeling of being at risk. So that is one area where perhaps women are disadvantaged when it comes to these protective measures. But at the same time, in Haiti, women don't tend to take on the more risky cases. So this is like a very interesting dynamic. And also you have the challenge of the political, the government always trying to control the judiciary. And I heard stories of prosecutors and judges who, if they didn't do what the government wanted, you were sent away to a faraway place to serve without any explanations or anything. So there are several both risks and challenges to being a judge in Haiti.
Mm-hmm. So is that a consideration that the women have when they is that something that deters women from being judges?
Can you repeat that, please?
No, I'm just following up on the same. Is the risks involved? Is that something that the women you interview are sort of giving as a consideration? Yeah,
it is. It's like it kind of forms every aspect of the working day. It's like they have to go home before 4, because then it will eventually get dark, and there are certain areas where they cannot go to, and especially during the last couple of years of political crisis in Haiti, some areas around the courts have been completely taken over by criminal gangs, for instance, so they're not even allowed to, it's not even possible to go to work in many instances.
So this is probably also part of being a woman in Haiti, and maybe being a judge in Haiti, and being a person in a very, very risky context. But Pilar, hearing what Marianne says, how does that compare to the situation, the pathways to the bench in Uganda? And
so no, that's I think the contrast is important, including in terms of the category of context that the project speaks to, which is this this category of fragile and conflict-affected states, but in fact, as you mentioned before, that covers a very broad range of political, social, and security conditions. So Haiti is at one of the most extreme ends of insecurity, of course, also with Afghanistan in different ways. I'll let Torunn will speak to Afghanistan. And Uganda is at the much more benign end in terms of security and risks of risk or threat of violence external to the judiciary that women judges may feel. So in the case of Uganda, entry to the judiciary, I suppose, starting from the bottom, it's an increasingly professionalized lower judiciary where mechanisms for recruitment are formalized and meritocratic, although there is some opacity on posting and promotion criteria. But it's fairly accepted that merit counts for entry to the judicial body. Promotion then and career pathways then begins to become much more gendered, owing to what seemed to come through in our interviews and a survey that we did, questions of class, rural-urban divide, but also what was described as availability for sexual favors or playing to being loyal to male mentors in judicial office. For higher positions, merit again is the first criteria, and entry is professionalized. The position follows a much more political route in keeping with high court appointments in many countries, which is where Parliament suggests and the President decides, and Parliament then confirms. But independence of the judicial role is conferred through security of tenure following appointment. What beyond these criteria, there's these merit-based qualifications for entry. What's not clear is then what are the criteria for moving up the echelons, and we certainly see that inequalities, gender-based inequalities, play out in the sense that women keep losing out from the top positions within the judiciary. But in that sense, it's important to go back to the logic of informal practices and informal rules, which are affected by the wider political context and the wider security context, which is so the way in which political loyalties operate and how much that might be a criteria for how promotion at the top level happens. But in the case of Uganda, what seems to prevail are just very gendered social norms based on gender discrimination, and where gender equality, despite the huge gains that have been made politically and by the women's movement over the last 30 or more years, has not been able to resolve. At the higher court levels, we heard less about the kind of threats of violence or sexual-based intimidation that seems much more present among the lower courts, but nonetheless, women clearly feel gender-based barriers for career progression. And I think maybe one of the questions for looking at the gendered experience of women judges in contrast to or in comparison to other public roles is that it's a very solitary position, and so those barriers are often experienced in a very solitary way because women, well, judges, the decision makers within the courtroom, but those gendered interferences with their role are very invisible in many respects, and that came out in our interviews as well, that there's something intangible about that gendered experience of exercising the role.
Thank you, Pilar. Thanks a lot. So Torunn, when you hear sort of quite different experiences from Haiti and Uganda, how does this compare with what you learned from Afghanistan?
I think at least the pathways to the courts are quite similar to those of Haiti, in the sense that we also, in Afghanistan, there's also an exam, competitive entry to a judicial course, which qualifies for becoming a judge or a prosecutor, which is based on an exam. So women have been entering this they call it stage course, in increasing number, and now about 20% of the students of this course, so the graduates of this course, are women, which roughly corresponds to the proportion of female students in higher education. And so you become a judge, you become qualified for this course by having a law degree. So it's fairly accessible to women, although there's been some talk recently of the entry being compromised by political networking and so on. The big kind of stumbling block for female judges in Afghanistan is after they graduate from this course. And there are 34 provinces in the country. And the Supreme Court, which is a powerful institution in Afghanistan, it appoints people to across the country, and they appoint women as well to the different provinces. Although for women, it's very difficult to take up postings outside of the capital, and it's quite complex reasons for this. For most of the last 4 decades, Afghanistan has been at war, and it's been in large periods been a war between a kind of modernizing state and a rural-based insurgency. So civil servants, including judges, has been targets. And in the last decade, hundreds of justice officials have been killed. And most of those have been men, for the reason that men are the ones that go to the provinces. Women do not generally have the support of their families to take up posts outside of the large cities. It's considered inappropriate for a woman to go alone and take up a position in another with no family members. Husbands are often reluctant to accompany them because they have their own career somewhere else, and also the accommodation that are in outside of the cities are not considered suitable for women. And women also feel that they are more of a target because as women, they're considered as kind of particular provocations to the insurgency. So what happens then every time there is a new round of appointments, a lot of women cannot simply not take up their posts. And this, I think, is the main reason. This is the reason why female judges told us this is our main challenge throughout last decades for why women do not want to become judges, because simply they cannot work. But in recent time, of course, the security situation has become even worse. So now these targeted assassinations that we've seen across the country is also moved into the capital. And only in January, 2 female judges were killed, assassinated on their way to work. So I think you asked earlier about the personal risks of women judges, and this is the main risk. I mean, for all judges in Afghanistan, it's a very, very dangerous job, and you are a target. I mean, there's been assassinations. There's also been attacks on the courts. A couple of years ago, the Supreme Court was targeted in a suicide bombing, and I believe 7 officials were killed. So it's a very dangerous jobs, and women feel this cross pressure because they don't have the same support from their family in taking risks. So they often feel very lonely. It's generally the threshold for family to say stay at home is generally lower with women, whereas men are considered the main provider and they must simply just endure the risks. You can discuss about the gendered implications of that, but the result is that women often feel that they don't have the support to work as judges. And also, of course, they have Afghanistan still being a very having a very traditional division of labor. They also have the housework and the children, and often get very little help in that. And they must. It's considered inappropriate for women, as in other countries, to stay at home, to stay out. So they often have to, if they stay late at night to work in the court, there's rumors about them, and so they don't have the same ability to take the workload that they need to do to get promotion. And when it comes to the more prestigious and powerful positions in the court system, they're all held by men. This has to do with many different things, I think. There's been, I think, still significant parts of the judiciary consider female judges as a provocation. In Afghanistan, being a judge takes on religious significations. You know, in a conservative country, being a judge is ultimately about implementing the will of God, because law is considered rooted in divine sources, and historically this has been seen as something that men can do with more. You know, women are compromised, not considered as ritually pure, not considered as rational, and these things still linger in parts of the judiciary. So that's one reason why female judges don't get ahead. Often they find male colleagues sidelining them, not wanting them to spend time with them, certainly not wanting to share an office with them. But then there is also the kind of networks and patronage politics where women are often not in the same position. They don't have the same networks. They can't socialize in the same way that men do and consolidate and build their networks. So that's another reason why they're often kind of not be able to access promotion. So yeah, many different things. In terms of sexual harassment, I think it's very difficult thing in Afghanistan to research, because it's once the rumor gets around that women are vulnerable to sexual harassment, you know, doors will shut for them. Their families will say, "Oh, fine, you're not working anymore in this sector," you know. So it's a very difficult thing to research. But it didn't. Female judges were saying that we're not the most vulnerable one, because we are powerful in the sense that nobody can. We have our position. You know, this is something that clerks and people who are on different types of contracts are much more vulnerable than what we are. Certainly no histories of this has emerged from the courts in recent years.
Thank you, Torunn. This is just very, very, very interesting, and we also, I mean, it's very clear that as we saw in the first round, that the situation is really different. That these women judges are working in very different circumstances, but also that the considerations, the pathways and considerations differ a lot. At the same time, it seems to me that one of the things that you're all saying is that it helps if systems are merit-based. It helps to have merit-based systems. None of these countries have quotas for women in the judiciary. And that is actually a question that came in from Lisa Maria now. She says, "Thank you for very interesting and important work. I'm wondering about quotas. What are your own perceptions of how they could potentially change the different pathways to the bench? And in what ways it would not work the same as with political representation? What are the debates in your respective countries, if any? So is there any debate on having quotas in the judiciary? And do you think that would sort of change the dynamics? And if so, in which ways?" I don't know who wants to start. Marianne?
Yeah, in Haiti, they actually have on paper quotas for the judiciary and for all public positions. So in politics and the judiciary, there are supposed to be 30% women at least. But the quota was just included in a constitutional amendment in 2012, and afterwards nothing really happened. So at least in politics, you don't see any effects of this quota at all. But what is interesting about the judiciary's role in Haiti is that they have become this quite progressive force in terms of women's representation, because they, even though there's no implementing policy following this constitutional amendment, so people basically don't know what to do with this quota, is that they have kind of used this quota as a guiding principle for their own institutional policy. So during the last class of the Magistrate School, the school leadership integrated a 50% quota in the recruitment. So they went out to law faculties and encouraged women to apply for the school. And as a consequence, 50% of all the graduates from the last class were women. So that is one way of introducing integrating quota through who you recruit to the Magistrate School, or as in Afghanistan, the stash. But how to do this in direct appointments is a much more complex question, I think. So maybe some of the other wants to dig into that.
Thank you, Marianne. Pilar, Torunn, do you want to chip in?
So in the case of Uganda, the number of women judges is, well, it's the most positive of the cases that we're talking here, and my sense is that that's not the issue for women on the bench. Rather, the issue is more the question of career progression and attaining the higher leadership roles. And so and so there the question is, okay, what are the barriers to that, and what are the things that what can women judges themselves do? What agency-related factors seem to help women on the bench? Quotas is not the problem, it seems, in the case of Uganda. So we found was that merit for sure was fundamental, but it wasn't sufficient. And some of the things that came up in our interviews and in the meeting we had with the women's organization, the National Women's Judges Association, was other kinds of skills that come into play. Things like assertiveness, particularly at the higher levels, assertiveness and the ability to obtain recognition. This was underlined by women judges as being something that they could lay claim to. Particularly lower up, political skills for negotiating and navigating the internal political economy of the judicial structure. I think also, as you've both mentioned, the importance of networks within the judiciary, creating valuable relationships with powerful male peers, but also networks and relationships outside of the judiciary. So establishing good relationships with organizations like FIDA, the Women Lawyers Association. This was seen as important by some. That varied hugely from individual to individual. But strategic alliances also with political networks were noted as important. There was considerable variation in terms of personal histories as activists on gender issues, I don't think that we could take as given in the case of Uganda that women judges have feminist tendencies. Rather, they pride themselves, as all judges in Uganda, in the independence of their role and in the professional approach to their role that's not led by normative positions, but by application and adjudication that's based on the law. Increasingly, and among younger, what was interesting was also generational differences, in the sense that for younger lawyers, the experience in private practice was seen as important, including for then being able to enter the judiciary more with more self-asserted and tested skills in terms of their ability to navigate wider roles. But certainly those individual skills mattered by way of complementing the necessary but not necessarily sufficient professional merit. What would be interesting to ask for all of us, and I think in Uganda was not so evident, was, so professional, at the collective level, professional associations matter. So the National Association of Women Judges was seen as a valuable professional association to belong to, and it provided consultative status. It was seen as a network also for advice and support. But what was less clear, and I think this is a question generally for the wider scholarship on the role of on the experience of women judges, is the role of women's organizations more broadly, in the sense that we know that feminist movements have been important in pushing for more presence of women in political and elective decision-making roles. In the case of women judges, that's far less clear, and it was not that evident in the case of Uganda. But I think in any case, what did matter, what did come up as a relevant factor in shaping experiences and pathways were issues related to intersectionality, issues related to class, political connectedness, ethnicity, that seemed to make a difference. And so again, in the case of Uganda, the quotas didn't come across as an issue in a way that seems more relevant for the other case studies.
Thank you, Pilar. What about Afghanistan? There are quotas for political office, as you said. So has there been a discussion of quotas in the judiciary?
Not that I'm aware of. I think that given that the ratio of women at the stage course, the kind of qualifying course, is the same as roughly the ratio of women in higher education, perhaps a good way to start would be to have a quota for women in higher education, which would be very controversial, but I think extremely effective, because it's very hard to get into universities in Afghanistan. A lot of competition, and you also have to set a competitive entry exam for that. So I think perhaps that would be more the way to proceed if there was to be a quota. And then, as Pilar said, it's more about getting ahead in the court system and getting promotion. Women tend to be stuck at the kind of lower level and in the least prestigious courts. And it would be hard to see how that would you could address that through a quota system. I mean, certainly in Afghanistan, women judges has been a kind of campaign issue for activists. The current president, President Ghani, he actually had the appointment of one woman to the Supreme Court as a campaign promise. And it was clearly that this was something that he did to get support from women activists and also perhaps the international aid community. But he failed to deliver on that because the woman candidate didn't get enough votes in parliament. She also didn't get votes from female parliamentarians, which a lot of people made a point about later on. Yeah, it's a tricky one with quotes. And now, of course, it's perhaps more about protecting the gains that have been achieved, because at the moment there is great uncertainty about the future. It looks very possible that the Taliban will be a significant part of the government. And they certainly, I would be very surprised if they didn't demand to have the position of Chief Justice, because a law is central to their kind of claims of legitimacy. And that would perhaps change a lot of things, because the head of the Supreme Court is the one that deals with appointments, it's the one that deals with qualifications. And what we could see perhaps is that there will be more emphasis on religious credentials in getting appointments. At the moment in Afghanistan, it's quite a peculiar system where you have two types of law degrees. You can have you can have a degree in political science and law, where you study the kind of codified laws and international law and so on, or you can have a degree in Sharia and Islamic studies, and then your background will be very different. You will be an expert in Islamic jurisprudence and interpretation of religious sources. So every year, or not every year, but every time they have an exam for the stage course, it's very interesting to see the balance. You know, how many questions are targeted towards those who have this more Islamic background, and how many are targeted towards those who have a more of a kind of a statutory law background. And the balance seems to be roughly 50-50. And almost all the female judges are they have the kind of law and political science background. So they would not, if the qualifying requirements were changed and more emphasis was given on this religious background, you know, speaking Arabic and knowing of Islamic jurisprudence, then that would drastically change the situation for female judges. Interestingly, within the Sharia faculties, there is some controversy, it seems, whether women should at all be judges, because it's not considered an appropriate position for a woman. So some female graduates from the Sharia faculties saying that I will not become a judge because it's not, you know, it's not appropriate according to my religion. So very few female judges are coming from those faculties. So at the moment, I think, and of course, the security situation, another scenario that could happen is a full-scale civil war. And when security worsens, it's always the women who are most restricted. So that might be another situation where we see less female judges. So yeah, in sum, I think now it's about not decreasing the situation or making the situation worse for female judges, rather than an introduction of quotas. But of course, you never know what the future might bring.
Thank you, Torunn. So we have about 10 minutes left. And what I want to ask you now is if you can reflect on sort of why do we need women judges? So why is it important that there are women judges? Or, I mean, there are so many answers to that, but also in terms of what difference do the women judges feel that they are making in the context that they operate? So it's a big question in a short time, but I want to go to Uganda first. Pilar.
So, I mean, in the research, I don't think we were able to draw conclusive findings as to whether it makes a difference on judicial outcomes, but I think that's a question rather than a finding based on yes, it makes a difference, or no, it doesn't make a difference. Some things came through in the interviews that women judges bring into the courtroom a sensitivity to gender dynamics, to the relationship between witnesses, the victim, the whoever's been the accused party, and based on their life experience of gender norms, that was noted as making a difference. But there was also a sense from some of the female judges that it's important not to essentialize women as being likely to be more or less, more just, or they are professionals who are doing their job, and their job is what it is. And I think that was a very valued perspective and position that some of the women judges that we spoke to signaled. Having said that, it matters enormously that women are present in this decision-making role, as in all decision-making roles, for a number of reasons. First of all, it's an indicator of gender equality in a society, that this decision-making role that has consequences, has an impact on the distribution of power and resources in society, that be held, that represent society as well. And so it's intrinsically important, not just instrumentally important, that women have equal presence on the bench. And also it's a marker of the wider structures of inclusion and non-discrimination, not only in the judicial branch, but in society generally, and in the political settlement itself, in how power is distributed, how decision-making roles are distributed. It's one among other indicators of inclusion and inequality, but it's an important one. I think it will be very valuable to do research that does look more at the nitty-gritty in these contexts of whether more women on the bench makes a difference to rulings, and whether there are some patterns that could be that might emerge from different areas or different issues of law and types of disputes. But in the case of Uganda, we haven't engaged into that. But yes, the intrinsic argument is the powerful one, and as with other gender equality objectives, the instrument, we need to look at the instrumental argument, but that should not be what's driving necessarily the case for this.
Thank you, Pilar. So, Torunn, in Afghanistan, what are the perception of not only the judges maybe, but also society of the importance? You already mentioned this, that this is an important issue for women's organizations and so on.
Yeah, like Pilar, I see this. There's the intrinsic argument and the instrumental argument. I think the instrumental argument has been strongest in Afghanistan, but it's also a bit of an ambivalent picture, because it's very true that for the courts to be more approachable to women, there should be more female judges, because in a very gender segregated country where there's a lot of kind of sanctions around privacy and women not sharing, it's difficult for women to share things of their personal life to a male stranger, not to mention things like rape and talking about the body and personal life. So definitely the courts will be more approachable, to women if there are more female judges, and also it's quite likely, I think, that women are more likely to favor women in sentencing and have a more better understanding of other women and what they go through in cases of abuse and so on. At the same time, there's also a kind of more or a less progressive argument for having female judges, which is to do about propriety and not, women shouldn't approach strange men, and it's good to have female judges because then all women can go there, and they won't come into this contact with men that they don't know. So one woman working in the Supreme Court, she told me that, you know, when female judges were first kind of recruited, this was the main argument. It was the government was seeing that more and more women would come to the court with cases such as divorce and so on, and they would then be directed to the main governor's office, which was where the courts were, and this was considered not good. You know, women would meet soldiers and police and all kind of officials, which they shouldn't meet, and it was much better than to have these separate family courts and to have female judges there. What we see now in Afghanistan is that female judges are disproportionately placed at family courts and these specialized courts for violence against women. And I think there is a risk that you have an argument that female judges is something that is tolerable just because of these reasons, but they shouldn't really, you know, go ahead and criminal law, which is much more prestigious, you see much less women. So yeah, it's a tricky one. I think a tricky balance between the kind of instrumental and intrinsic. Of course, if you assume that women and men have equal intellectual capabilities, which is not taken for granted in large parts of this world, but then it is important to have female judges for that reason, because otherwise, a high number of female judges, otherwise we just simply wouldn't get the best equipped judges. So that I think is a very important argument. The instrumental one is important, but there has certain pitfalls.
Thank you, Torunn. Thank you very much. Marianne, how does this look from Haiti?
Well, yeah, it's complicated as in the other cases. But it seems like this argument of women bringing, on one side, a lot of judges talk about women bringing something different in their judging, but at the same time they say that judges has no sex. So it's this like kind of conflict between this, like the neutrality of the role, but also the fact that women in Haiti face gender discrimination and abuse by simply existing. And it seemed that also the women judges in Haiti were much more passionate. When I asked what kind of cases are you most passionate about, a majority of the women said rape cases and gender-based violence cases, whereas the men were not as passionate about those kinds of cases. And also there were stories about how female court users who had been victims of violence asked to see a female judge rather than a male judge. But of course, just being a woman does not entail that you are a feminist, and there's a lot of men who are way better feminists than many women. So I think this is also something that this gender consciousness is perhaps something that can be learned as well. And this is again where the Magistrate School is playing a very important role by incorporating gender-based violence courses for all judges, not just the women. Yeah, and then there's also the aspect of corruption. Again, there was a very widely held view in Haiti that women judges were much less corrupt than men. And again, there might be a point to that, thinking about how when men and women are recruited to the judiciary, women have less of these political bonds. But that's not necessarily because they were born this way, but maybe they're not corrupt because they don't have the chance to be corrupt on the same level as men. So that is more like but it's something that's interesting to look into too as well. And in a country like Haiti, where corruption is so widespread and where people have very, very low trust in the judiciary, it might signal something different to the court users.
Thank you so much, Marianne. I have so many more questions I would like to ask you and to follow up on, but our time is up. So I just want to thank you all, Torunn Wimpelmann, Marianne Tøraasen, Pilar Domingo, to thank Elin Skår, who is head of this Women on the Bench research project. And I want to also wish all of you a continuously happy Women's Day.